Is Peter Goggi. He's the president of the Tea Association of the USA. Thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here, Rachelle.
So let's start with a brief overview of the structure and the scope of the international tea market from farm to cup.
So the tea industry, as one of your speakers earlier stated, is incredibly labor intensive. And it is the smallholders in particular represent about 60% of those people who actually produce the tea from the bush. So these are the people that have been most hardest hit in this COVID requirement of distance protocols and stay-at-home orders.
And as we saw in the reporter's package there, the tea harvest in India already being affected by COVID-19 lockdowns. How costly is missing this first flush harvest in India for Darjeeling tea in terms of how it affects the rest of the country's tea industry?
So in Darjeeling in particular, in reality, their overall production as part of India's production is very small. It only produces about 8 to 8.5 million kilos, whereas India produces over 1.3 billion kilos. So in terms of volume, it's actually small. However, the growers in Darjeeling produce some of the finest teas in the world, very artisanal, very unique flavor, and their first flush is extraordinarily prized by those people who love this flavor in tea. And the first flush generates about 50% of their overall profit through the year. So having missed this time period, and they're down by about 50 to 60%, has really hurt them in terms of their earnings on the tea that they produce.
And are we seeing harvests in other major tea producing countries similarly impacted?
Actually not. Not all tea producing countries have adopted the same protocols in terms of COVID, and some of the seasonalities are different as well. So in some areas of the world, they're not even producing tea. So Argentina, for example, which happens to be the largest importer of tea into the United States, is not even producing tea at this time of year. So we see a big difference from country to country in terms of the overall impact of tea being produced.
Now, we know that Kenya is one of the world's top tea exporters, but it was already dealing with an ongoing locust plague. So what are some of the other challenges that major tea-producing countries were already dealing with even before the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, prior to COVID, one of the biggest challenges, quite honestly, is the lack of fair remuneration to the full supply chain. So in reality, the growers of tea around the world of the producing countries have not truly received a fair value for the teas that they produce. This has been going on actually for decades. We do see boom and bust cycles where there are times in which they make a very fair return, but generally speaking, the return has declined. So in terms of the health of the tea market, this actually, in my view, is a positive aspect because it has limited to some degree the amount of tea available and hopefully will drive the tea up. I also remember hearing from one of your earlier speakers, that they're drinking more tea a day. Tea is good for you. It's healthy. People recognize that. And particularly in times of COVID, we're seeing a tremendous increase in the United States on retail sales of tea.
And you mentioned this idea of fairness in terms of, making sure that everyone is paid properly. Let's look at the income for some of these workers. Are these mostly traditionally seasonal workers who depend on these harvests to earn money, or are they able to sort of pivot and get into other forms of income during this time?
Well, I think it depends on the actual smallholder. Many of them have alternate crops in which they can make a living, but most of the world people who are working as a smallholder and producing tea, this is their major form of income. So there's no doubt that this is going to hurt them in the long run.
I do want to get to China, obviously the world's biggest tea exporter. They also have a very large domestic market. Do you see their market being disrupted much by all this?
I really don't. They experienced COVID a little bit earlier than the rest of the world. So they were back working in March, late March, early April. So that's really their first flush on some of their teas. So I don't see a real big impact in terms of domestic consumption or impact of COVID on the supply of tea internally.
All right, thank you so much. Peter Goggi there, the president of the Tea Association of the USA.
Thank you very much.